Recall that key ratios of a company are derived by critically analyzing various parameters of that company that we had covered in the previous module. Apart from helping us determine the financial valuation of a company, ratios also help us determine its operational efficiency that leads to its performance. Operational efficiency of a company can be determined using the following ratios. The first one is debtors turnover ratio. The second one is creditors turnover ratio. The third one is inventory turnover ratio. The fourth one is fixed asset turnover ratio. And the fifth one is asset turnover ratio. We would be going over these ratios in the order that we have mentioned them here. Let's come to our first ratio here, the debtors turnover ratio. Debtors turnover ratio measures how quickly is the firm able to convert its sales into cash. Usually firms make sales on two bases or two manners. The first is cash sales, where the payment is made immediately by the customers, and the second is credit sales, where the payment is made after a few days by the customers as pre-decided between the firm and the customers. Net credit sales are taken into consideration while calculating this ratio. Debtors turnover ratio or DTR is equal to net credit sales divided by average accounts receivable. Average accounts receivable is equal to receivables at the start of the financial year plus receivables at the end of the financial year divided by 2. Debtors turnover ratio can also be measured in terms of days. Debtors turnover ratio in terms of days is equal to 365 divided by debtors turnover ratio. This ratio measures in terms of days how quickly do the firm's customers pay back their credit. Let's take the case of ABC Limited to understand this more in detail. From the table below, we can see that the debtors turnover ratio of ABC Limited went from 6 in 2016-17 to 5 in 2017-18 and then went back to 6.3 in 2018-19. Similarly, the debtors turnover ratio in terms of days went from 60.8 in 2016-17 to 73 in 2017-18 and came back to 57.9 in 2018-19. As we can see, the higher the debtors turnover ratio, the more quickly do a firm's customers pay back their credit. From this, we can conclude that A, the debtors turnover ratio, the higher the better, and B, the debtors turnover ratio in terms of days, the lower the better. The second ratio that we will be covering is creditors turnover ratio. Creditors turnover ratio or CTR measures how quickly is a firm able to pay back its suppliers in terms of credit purchases. A firm purchases raw materials in two manners. One, cash purchases where the payment is made immediately, and two, credit purchases when the firm pays its suppliers after a specified period of time. Net credit purchases are taken into account while calculating creditors turnover ratio. Therefore, creditors turnover ratio is equal to net credit purchases divided by average accounts payable. Average accounts payable is equal to accounts payable at the start of the financial year plus accounts payable at the end of the financial year divided by 2. Creditors turnover ratio can also be measured in terms of days. Creditors turnover ratio in terms of days is equal to 365 divided by creditors turnover ratio. This measure, which is the creditors turnover ratio in terms of days, measures how quickly in terms of days is a firm able to pay back its suppliers. Let's take the example of ABC Limited to understand this more in detail. As we can see from the table below, the creditors turnover ratio has gone from 5 in 2016-17 to 12 in 2018-19. At the same time, the creditors turnover ratio in terms of days has gone down from 73 in 2016-17 to 30.4 in 2018-19. This shows how when the creditors turnover ratio is high, the firm takes lesser time to pay back its suppliers. Therefore, from this we can conclude that the higher the creditors turnover ratio, the better is a firm position to pay back its suppliers, and therefore is a good sign. While the lower the creditors turnover ratio in terms of days, the better is the firm paying back its suppliers, and therefore is a healthy sign. The next measure that we will be looking at is inventory turnover ratio. Inventory turnover ratio, or ITR, broadly measures the number of times a firm sells its inventory in a given year. Broadly, it is measuring the speed at which the firm is selling its inventory. Inventory turnover ratio is equal to net sales divided by average inventory. Average inventory is equal to inventory at the start of the financial year plus inventory at the end of the financial year divided by 2. Inventory turnover ratio can also be measured in terms of days. Inventory turnover ratio in terms of days is equal to 365 divided by inventory turnover ratio. The inventory turnover ratio in terms of days broadly measures the speed in terms of days, which is how much time does a company take to deplete or sell its inventory. Let's take the example of ABC Limited to understand this more in detail. As we can see from the table below, the inventory turnover ratio of ABC Limited went from 7.8 in 2016-17 to 16 in 2018-19. At the same time, its inventory turnover ratio in terms of days went from 46.8 in 2016-17 to 22.8 in 2018-19. This shows how when the inventory turnover ratio is high, the firm is taking lesser time to deplete its inventory. From this, we can conclude that a high inventory turnover ratio is good for the firm, while a low inventory turnover ratio in terms of days is good for the firm. Our next ratio, the fixed asset turnover ratio, shows how efficiently is a company able to generate sales from its fixed assets. Fixed assets of a company include property, plant, machinery, and equipment. Net sales are taken into account while calculating this ratio. Fixed asset turnover ratio is equal to net sales divided by average fixed assets. Average fixed assets is equal to fixed assets at the start of the financial year plus fixed assets at the end of the financial year divided by 2. Let's take the example of our favorite company, ABC Limited, to understand this more in detail. From the table below, we can see that the fixed asset turnover ratio of ABC Limited went from 3.2 in 2016-17 to 3.1 in 2017-18 and then went back up to 3.2 in 2018-19. As a thumb rule, the higher the fixed asset turnover ratio, the better is a firm utilizing its fixed assets to generate sales revenue, and therefore the better is a fixed asset turnover ratio. Also, it's important to note that the fixed asset turnover ratio must be compared of companies within the same industry. This, to give a small example of this, companies in industries like utilities, which are more capital intensive, need more fixed assets for their functioning than companies in the industry of information technology, which is inherently less capital intensive and therefore requires lesser fixed assets. Like the fixed asset turnover ratio, the asset turnover ratio also measures how efficiently is a firm able to utilize its asset to generate sales. Assets are of two kinds, fixed assets and current assets. The fixed asset turnover ratio takes into account only fixed assets while calculating the efficiency of the firm. The asset turnover ratio takes into account both fixed assets and current assets, making the same calculation for the turnover ratio. Current assets include assets like cash, inventories, among others. Net sales are taken into account while calculating this ratio as well. Asset turnover ratio is equal to net sales divided by average assets. Average assets in this case is equal to assets at the start of the financial year plus assets at the end of the financial year divided by 2. Let's take the example of ABC Limited to understand this more in detail. From the table below, we can see that the asset turnover ratio of ABC Limited has gone up from 2.2 in 2016-17 to 2.9 in 2018-19. As a thumb rule, the greater the asset turnover ratio, the better is a firm utilizing its assets to generate sales revenue. This ratio, like the fixed asset turnover ratio, also needs to be compared of companies who are within the same industry.